What would you think if I told you that most suffering is not caused by the world itself, but by our frantic attempt to control it? A man wakes up to silence, but already the storm has begun, not around him but within him. His mind rehearses outcomes that haven't happened. His heart clings to expectations never promised. He walks through the day chained to results, grasping at conversations, reactions, fortunes, people, anything that might validate the illusion that he is in control. But he is not. He is not leading the day. He is being led by the fear of losing it. And this is where most people live, in resistance to reality. They do not see the world as it is, but as it should be, shaped, squeezed, and forced into submission by the trembling hands of the ego. They mistake anxiety for ambition. They call attachment love. They think control is strength, when in truth, it is fear. Fear dressed in discipline. Fear disguised as drive. A woman pours her soul into a relationship, thinking that if she gives enough, sacrifices enough, explains herself clearly enough, she will finally be safe. But safety was never guaranteed by another human. She fears the silence after a message. She overanalyzes his glance, his tone, the space between his words. And so her life becomes a tightrope walk between who she is and who she thinks she must be to hold on. What she doesn't see is that her suffering doesn't come from him. It comes from her refusal to let go. The ego, by nature, is terrified of surrender. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. It cannot sit in ambiguity. It thrives on the illusion of control, of people, of perception, of outcomes. But Stoicism whispers the forgotten truth. Control is not the goal. Mastery is. And mastery has a different definition than most are taught. To master life is not to dictate its terms, but to learn which terms are yours to dictate. You can't control whether they love you. You can't control if the world understands you. You can't control outcomes, timing, luck, or weather. But you can control your focus. You can control your integrity. You can control how you show up when nothing goes your way. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet wrote in secret to remind himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This was not just philosophy. It was survival. A man with enemies on every border, betrayal in every corner, still returned to one sanctuary no tyrant could touch, the dominion of his own mind. But how many people today still search for that dominion outside themselves? They try to control what others think. They try to control how they are perceived. They try to rewrite the past through guilt, or predict the future through obsession. They try to prevent heartbreak by becoming invisible, obedient, agreeable, and in doing so, they abandon the only place where true power lives, their own center. If a man builds his self-worth on outcomes, he becomes a slave to everything he cannot control. His joy becomes a hostage to other people's behavior. His peace depends on whether or not his plans unfold perfectly. And so he lives in quiet desperation, appearing confident but hollow inside, because his worth is rented, not rooted. But the Stoic, the one who understands, does not chase control over the uncontrollable. He sharpens his will like a blade, not to conquer others, but to cut through the fog of his own illusions. He does not collapse when life says no. He does not beg the world to be fair. He does not try to control the ocean. He learns to sail. Control what you can. Let go of the rest. This is not weakness. This is not passivity. This is sacred realism. The kind that doesn't just survive chaos but dances through it, unburned, because it never clung to anything that could be lost. You too have this power. But it will cost you your illusion. It will cost you the story that everything must go your way. It will cost you the fantasy that love, success, approval, any of it, can be guaranteed by force. But what you gain in return is priceless. Presence, peace, precision. You no longer move from desperation, but from clarity. You stop reacting to every trigger and start responding with purpose. You stop chasing what leaves and start nurturing what stays. Your principles, your presence, your path. The tragedy of control is that it never ends. Even when you win, you don't rest. You calculate the next variable, the next threat, the next step to hold on to what you've gained. Control breeds anxiety, not security. The more tightly you grip something, a person, a plan, a perception, the more fragile it becomes. Not because it was never real, but because your fear smothered its ability to breathe. People don't lose peace because life is chaotic. They lose peace because they believe they must conquer the chaos. They believe that if they try hard enough, love well enough, perform consistently enough, they can outrun the inevitable shifts of life. But nature has always moved in cycles. Tides rise and fall. Relationships evolve. Fortunes change. People drift. To resist this is not bravery, it is blindness. And yet, the modern world feeds this blindness. From childhood, people are trained to control their image, their emotions, their worthiness. Boys are told, don't cry, dominate. Girls are told, be perfect, be pleasing. Entire lives are lived from this programming, and then they wonder why adulthood feels like a performance instead of a truth. But the soul does not want to perform. The soul longs to be, and it is in being, raw, unguarded, aware, that real power begins. A man learns this when he stops chasing the woman who left. He sits in silence, and instead of trying to make her return, he asks what her absence revealed about his wounds. He sees how he confused being needed with being loved, how he tolerated neglect because chaos felt familiar, how he thought controlling her would heal the little boy inside him who was once abandoned. And in that moment, he is no longer just a man in grief. He is a man awakening. A woman learns this when she stops apologizing for outgrowing people who kept her small. She no longer begs for understanding. She no longer twists herself into something softer so they can feel strong. She learns that her worth was never negotiable, only forgotten. And with that remembrance comes a silence that no rejection can shake. This is what Stoic philosophy calls ataraxia, a deep, unshakable inner stillness. Not because life is gentle, but because your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer ruled by what you can't control. You are ruled by what you won't give away. Your clarity, your choice, your voice. The one who controls the inner world becomes unpredictable to the outer world. Why? Because he doesn't respond from habit, but from truth. He does not explode when insulted. He does not cling when threatened. He does not need to be liked to stand tall. He has divorced himself from the addiction to approval, and in doing so, he becomes dangerous in the quietest way. Most people want control because they are afraid. But fear is not always loud. Sometimes it's disguised as overachievement, as endless planning, as the inability to rest, as the need to fix others to avoid fixing yourself. Control is not just about power, it's about protection. Protection from pain, protection from uncertainty, protection from rejection. But the paradox is that the very attempt to control life creates suffering. Epictetus said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." This isn't detachment out of coldness. It's detachment out of clarity. The understanding that you are not here to bend the universe to your will. You are here to become so rooted in truth that no matter how the wind shifts, you remain upright. So you stop over-explaining. You stop begging. You stop performing. You stop micromanaging other people's opinions. You start tending to your own soil. You water your discipline. You prune your projections. You plant boundaries like sacred fences around your peace. And suddenly, life becomes lighter. Not because it got easier, but because you stopped carrying what was never yours to hold. You are not here to fix every broken thing. You are not here to make everyone love you. You are not here to win approval from those who abandoned their own soul. You are here to master your inner world, and in doing so, you change your outer one. A man who walks the Stoic path eventually comes to a brutal truth. Most of what he thought he needed to control was simply a reflection of his own unhealed fear. His constant effort to manage how others saw him was a mask, a fragile shield worn by the part of him that never felt worthy unless he was winning. But winning what? A glance? A nod? A brief illusion of certainty? Certainty is a seductive lie. The world promises it in metrics: salary, status, loyalty, likes. But the soul is not moved by these. The soul doesn't ask, "Am I safe?" It asks, "Am I true?" And the deeper a man answers that question, the less he clings to outcomes. He no longer needs to control who stays, who claps, who understands. Because he's no longer living for confirmation. He's living for congruence. This shift terrifies the ego. It panics when detachment begins, because the ego feeds on control. It fears surrender, because surrender means death to the story it built. A story in which validation equals value. A story where love must be earned through pleasing, proving, or enduring. And so it resists, fiercely. But the Stoic doesn't kill the ego. He tames it. He invites it to quiet down while the soul steps forward. And in that stillness, something rare happens. Power begins to root itself in humility. He no longer interrupts silence just to fill space. He no longer takes offense when none was intended. He no longer explains his boundaries to those committed to crossing them. He no longer enters battles just because he was provoked. This is the quiet strength of the grounded man. The man who does not need to win the room because he already owns himself. The man who does not confuse resistance with masculinity or reactivity with wisdom. The man who knows that letting go is not weakness, it is sovereignty. And what about her? The woman who once believed that controlling everything meant safety. She begins to notice the weight of constant vigilance, how her nervous system flinched at silence, how her worth was chained to response times and emotional caretaking, how she mistook chaos for chemistry. And when she stops, really stops, she sees it for what it was: trauma wearing the mask of control. She breathes for the first time without asking who might leave because of it. She walks away without narrating the reasons. She stops chasing explanations from those who were never listening. And in that space, she meets herself. Not as someone who must be needed to feel valuable, but as someone who is whole, even in solitude. This is what the ancient Stoics knew, what they lived through war, betrayal, exile, and plague. That no matter how wild the world became, the most radical act of strength was to stand firm in what is yours and release everything that is not. Control what you can: your word, your breath, your character, your presence when pressure mounts. Let go of the rest, their reaction, their approval, their story about who you are, because once you stop trying to manage the uncontrollable, your energy is no longer diluted. Your focus sharpens. Your voice deepens. You become precise, not just in speech, but in spirit. You no longer need to shout, because your silence speaks with integrity. This is the energy that confuses people. They call it cold, distant, intimidating. But it's not distance. It's discernment. It's what happens when you stop auditioning for roles that betray your truth. When you leave the stage entirely and build something sacred off script. From that place, you stop asking, "Will they stay?" and start asking, "Do I stay with myself when they leave?" You stop wondering, "How can I fix this?" and start declaring, "This no longer fits me." You stop pleading, "Do you understand me?" and start owning, "I understand myself enough to walk on." Let go. Not to give up, but to grow up. Let go because peace is too expensive to be rented to external validation. Let go because every time you try to control what isn't yours, you abandon what is. The Stoic doesn't build walls, he builds foundations. Quiet, unshakable foundations that weather both praise and rejection without collapse. He watches storms without absorbing them. He hears noise without echoing it. He feels pain without becoming it. Because that's the power of letting go. It doesn't detach you from life. It anchors you deeper into it. There is a sacred weightlessness that comes when you finally stop trying to hold what was never yours. You don't become indifferent, you become undisturbed. You don't become passive, you become potent. Because in releasing your grip on the uncontrollable, you begin to wield the only true authority you've ever had, the authorship of your response. That is what they don't teach you in school or in most relationships. They teach you to manage impressions, to control how you're perceived, to pursue the external until you forget there's an internal that's dying. They tell you to push harder, climb faster, outshine, outperform, and you do, for years. Until one day, your body revolts. Your soul whispers, "What are you chasing?" And the silence that follows shakes everything. Most people interpret that silence as failure, but the Stoic interprets it as an invitation. Because silence reveals. It unmasks the illusions that noise keeps alive. And in that exposure, you see it clearly. The futility of controlling the uncontrollable. The madness of depending on approval to feel real. You remember the relationships where you lost yourself just to be loved. The jobs you endured because you feared uncertainty more than burnout. The lies you told just to avoid judgment. And in that remembering, something breaks. But it's not you. It's the illusion. Let it break. Because in the ruins of that control-based identity, you find something raw and ancient. Your ability to choose meaning over manipulation. To choose presence over performance. To choose values over validation. This choice is not loud. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need a victory speech. It just needs you. As you are, without the armor, without the control scripts, without the constant internal negotiation for permission to exist. And what happens when you finally stop negotiating? You become magnetic in a different way. Not because you're trying to attract, but because you've stopped repelling your own truth. People sense something in you. A stillness. A refusal to engage in games. A clarity that makes them confront their own noise. They may call you distant. They may say you've changed. They may try to provoke you, not to harm you, but to pull you back into the frequency where they still live, the realm of reactivity. But you won't go. Not because you're better, but because you've outgrown the need to prove that you are. There is no need to explain your evolution to those who benefited from your confusion. No need to water yourself down just so others feel tall. No need to chase closure when your peace now comes from understanding yourself, not being understood. This is Stoicism not as concept, but as embodiment, as practice, as daily reckoning with the pull to control and the choice to release. You see it in the small moments. When you resist the urge to reread that message, hoping for a different emotion. When you stop overthinking their silence and start listening to your own. When you walk away not with bitterness, but with breath. This is the real work. Not forcing life into form, but forming yourself into someone who can dance through the shapelessness. Because the truth is, you were never meant to tame the storm. You were meant to become the eye of it. You were never meant to control the hearts of others. You were meant to know yours so deeply that theirs no longer determines its rhythm. You were never meant to manage every outcome. You were meant to live aligned so that no outcome could take away your peace. The Stoic is not a statue. He is not frozen. He feels everything, deeply. But he is unmoved, not because he's numb, but because he's rooted. Rooted in the clarity that pain is not always to be fixed. Sometimes it is to be felt. Rooted in the knowing that uncertainty is not the enemy. It is the birthplace of faith. Rooted in the strength to say, I will not be owned by what I cannot change. And from that rootedness, He does not react. He responds. With choice, with intention, with restraint that doesn't repress, but reveals. Because that restraint, that pause before you explode, that breath before you collapse, that is where the transformation happens. That is where the shadow meets the light. That is where ego begins to kneel before awareness. And slowly, silently, the man or woman who once lived clenched begins to open. Opening is not easy. It's not the grand spiritual cliché it's often painted to be. It's brutal. It's raw. Because to open, truly open, you must allow everything you've buried to rise. The ache of unmet childhood needs, the rage you swallowed just to be liked, the shame that wrapped itself around your softness and called it weakness. To open is to no longer run, not from them, not from your past, not even from the parts of you that you still don't know how to love. That's why most people don't open. They control, they cling, they react, because it's easier to lash out than to ask, what does this say about me? It's easier to dominate than to admit, I'm afraid. It's easier to perform strength than to embody it. But the Stoic, the real one, not the pretender in a cold disguise, knows that true strength isn't in suppression, it's in integration. He integrates his rage, so it no longer controls him. She integrates her grief, so it no longer defines her. They meet their shadow, not to destroy it, but to reclaim what was hidden in it, the truth, the tenderness, the trauma, the power. This is individuation, what Jung called the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, not who you were taught to be, not who you performed to be, but who you were before the world got to you, before they told you to sit down, be nice, be quiet, fit in, hustle, win, before you fragmented into socially acceptable pieces. Control delays individuation. It distracts you from the mirror. It gives you tasks. Micromanage this, worry about that, please them, fix that mess, prove you're okay. But freedom? Freedom lives in the pause, in the space between your old trigger and your new response, in the moment when you finally say, I will not abandon myself again, not even for comfort. Because make no mistake, comfort is one of the most seductive forms of control. You control what you feel by numbing it. You control what you need by pretending you don't. You control who leaves by leaving first. But what if the discomfort isn't your enemy? What if it's your teacher? The discomfort of not texting back, the discomfort of saying no, the discomfort of being misunderstood, of disappointing someone, of being seen not as perfect, but as whole. This is the cost of freedom. But it's also the gateway to something deeper than freedom: peace. Peace doesn't come from making everyone happy. It comes from no longer needing them to be. Peace doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from being unafraid of the questions. Peace doesn't come from control. It comes from connection to yourself. And when you're connected to yourself, when you've sat long enough in your own soul that your identity no longer flinches at silence, then no one can take that from you. Not the one who ghosts, not the one who blames, not the world when it turns its back. You remain whole, here, centered. That's what makes the Stoic dangerous. Not his detachment, but his depth. Not that he doesn't feel, but that he knows what to do with what he feels. Not that she doesn't cry, but that she never lets the tears wash away her values. There's something magnetic about someone who cannot be manipulated by guilt or seduced by validation. Someone who no longer apologizes for evolving. Someone who chooses their energy like a sacred ritual. And people notice. Even if they don't know what they're feeling, they feel it. Your unavailability to chaos. Your unwillingness to play the old emotional games. Your silent refusal to betray your stillness, just to be seen. That's sovereignty. Not the ability to control others, but the discipline to control yourself when it matters most. So you don't flinch when they question you. You don't fold when they mock your calm. You don't explain when your absence says everything, because now you understand. Peace is not passive. It is active, forged in fire, maintained by boundaries, and protected by choices no one else sees. You walk through the world like water, flexible, but never formless. You flow around obstacles. You crash only when necessary. You nourish, but you do not beg. And when someone tries to bottle you, to label you, to trap you in their story, you slip through their fingers, because what cannot be controlled cannot be captured. There is a moment in every life where the soul demands silence. Not just external silence, but the kind that stretches deep into your nervous system and asks, can you sit with yourself now, without the noise? Most run from this. They fill it with distraction, with argument, with endless dialogue that keeps them away from the mirror. But you've made it this far because you didn't run. Or if you did, you stopped. You turned around. You faced the fire. And in that fire, something ancient awoke. It told you the truth. You don't need to be louder to be stronger. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to grasp for things that crumble when you release them. Control was the illusion. Sovereignty, quiet, deep, sacred sovereignty, was always the goal. It begins in that moment when your entire body screams to react. And you don't. You pause. You breathe. You observe. Not just the person in front of you, but the wound they triggered. Not just the insult, but the echo of something deeper. An old rejection, a long-forgotten ache, a shadow rising to be known. This is the work, not to fight it, not to fix it, but to see it without becoming it. When Seneca said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality," he wasn't being poetic. He was warning you. The real suffering begins when you give your power away to a story. A story that says, "They made me feel this. I must fix this now. I can't let them win." But the Stoic knows, you are not your story. You are the one who can rewrite it. And that rewriting doesn't happen through revenge or reaction. It happens through stillness, through choosing, moment after moment, to let go of what belongs to someone else. Their projections, their pain, their chaos masquerading as urgency. You are not a dumping ground for other people's unprocessed emotions. You are not a participant in every argument that comes knocking. You are not a hostage to the emotions that rise within you. Not when you've trained yourself to witness instead of obey. This witnessing is not avoidance. It is mastery. It's standing at the cliff's edge of your own pattern and saying, "I see you. I've been you. But I choose differently now." And when you make that choice, not once, but repeatedly, you begin to rewire your very relationship with life. You stop needing chaos to feel alive. You stop needing approval to feel lovable. You stop needing certainty to feel safe. Instead, you start cultivating something that no one can touch, your presence. Because presence is your sanctuary. It's where shame cannot live, because there's nothing to hide. It's where fear cannot dominate, because you've stopped outsourcing your power. It's where pain doesn't vanish, but transforms into wisdom, into vision, into strength that no longer performs. And yes, it will confuse people. Your peace will unsettle them. Your refusal to argue will offend them. Your unshakability will feel like arrogance to those who benefit from your insecurity. Let it. Do not dim to soothe someone's discomfort with your growth. Do not explain your restraint to someone who only respects reaction. Do not shrink into someone else's story of you, just to keep the peace, because that kind of peace is treason to your soul. You are no longer required to be accessible to dysfunction. You are allowed to be misunderstood. You are allowed to protect your energy like a fortress, not because you're cold, but because you've learned, the hard way, what it costs to let just anyone inside. And so, you become that rare kind of human, the one who listens more than they speak, the one who smiles without performance, the one who chooses silence not because they are weak, but because they are free. And when the storm comes, because it always will, you do not flinch. You do not fight the weather. You become the ground, rooted, ready, refusing to be moved by what never belonged to you in the first place. This is Stoicism lived, not preached, not intellectualized, but embodied. To live from the inside out, to choose your response instead of chasing control, to surrender the illusion and claim the truth. That peace was never out there. It was always the result of one sacred choice, to let go. Somewhere along the path, when the noise has faded and your hands are no longer gripping ghosts, you begin to feel it. Not euphoria, not triumph, but something quieter. Freedom. Not the kind painted in movies or bought with rebellion. Not the freedom of doing whatever you want, whenever you want. But the deeper kind. The kind that comes when you no longer need to fight your own reflection. When you are no longer a slave to someone else's chaos. When you can stand still while the world spins in dysfunction and know, with terrifying clarity, I don't have to go with it. This is the final turning. You do not become detached from life. You become devoted to it in a higher way. You no longer invest in outcomes. You invest in alignment. You walk into every moment not to control it, but to meet it. Not to dominate it, but to respond in a way that honors your values, your vision, your truth. And what once would have triggered you no longer finds a handle. What once demanded your energy no longer qualifies. What once pulled you into a war of egos now passes through your presence like wind through a mountain. Because that is who you've become. Not a puppet, not a reaction machine, not a being made of buttons for others to push. You've removed them, all of them. Now, your decisions come from awareness, not fear. Your words come from clarity, not compulsion. Your actions come from sovereignty, not survival. This doesn't mean you don't feel pain. You do. But it no longer governs you. It no longer owns your voice. You cry and still speak with love. You ache and still move with principle. You grieve and still choose boundaries. Because now you understand that emotions are messengers, not masters. You welcome them, learn from them, honor them, but you do not kneel to them. And this subtle sacred shift, it changes everything. You start building things that last, not because you control them, but because you no longer sabotage them. You attract people who are rooted, not addicted to your drama, but drawn to your depth. You lose some, yes, but only the ones who fed on your need to be needed. Only the ones who mistook your former chaos for connection. You don't chase anymore. You don't explain. You don't prove. You live. Rooted, responsive, radiant in your restraint. You find a rhythm that isn't frantic, but full. You find a love that doesn't perform, but holds. You find a self that doesn't shatter, but expands. This is what Stoicism was always pointing toward. Not an escape from life, but a deeper entrance into it. Not the death of feeling, but the mastery of response. Not coldness, but clarity. You're no longer manipulated by praise. You're no longer undone by rejection. You're no longer seduced by urgency. You've returned to what can never be taken. Your breath, your center, your presence. And when the world asks why you're so calm in the fire, why you're so graceful in the storm, why their chaos doesn't move you anymore, you do not offer a sermon. You smile, because you remember the old you, the one who broke at every misunderstanding, the one who twisted to be chosen, the one who tried to manage everything, just to feel okay. But now, you let go. Not because you don't care, but because you care so deeply, you will no longer abandon yourself for what can't love you back. So when the test comes again, and it will, you will meet it not with control, but with courage. You will meet it with breath, with presence, with the silence of someone who knows. Nothing owns me. No one commands me. I choose my response. And that is all the control I need. If something in this video spoke to your mind, or touched your heart, hit like to spread stillness in a world drowning in noise. Subscribe and turn on the bell to explore even deeper topics on psychology, philosophy, and the quiet return to your most powerful, peaceful self. Because you're not just watching a video, you're stepping into a new way of being, one that's worth everything.